Well, hi there. This hyper unusual bird is a Hoatzin, the only living species in the family Opisthocomidae, the only extant family in the order Opisthocomiformes, a living fossil. And man, do they look like a living fossil. I mean, birds date back to the Jurassic. Sometimes people erroneously think that birds evolved after the extinction of the other dinosaurs, but you can't evolve from an extinct lineage. Birds lived alongside the other dinosaurs for the majority of the Mesozoic era. And when you imagine a Jurassic bird, I don't think you'd be far off base to imagine something that looks a heck of a lot like a Hoatzin. Once you know that feathers were common in dinosaurs, nothing about this bird screams that it isn't a dinosaur. It looks like one. In fact, there is one thing about them that really makes them seem like primitive birds, and that would be their clawed fingers. 2 on each wing. Something we don't really see, at least not this well developed, in any other birds alive today, but something very common in early birds. You see them all over in toothed birds like Archaeopteryx, but also in beaked birds like Confuciusornis. In fact, large clawed fingers like this are very common in Jurassic and early Cretaceous birds. Wings without such fingers really don't become the norm in birds until the later Cretaceous. So the Hoatzin appears to be a lineage of birds that has maintained this ancestral form, but that isn't so. However, that is only clear today because of phylogenetic analysis. The same tool that will make it apparent that dinosaurs probably didn't have lips. But I'll get to that this Dinosaur December. Because right now, we're going to have to take a look at Hoatzins and where they fit into the phylogeny of birds, to find out why this apparently primitive lineage of living fossils is, in fact, not so primitive at all, but that they are, instead, rather close relatives of penguins. No, not these. Real penguins. So let's dig in to the rather astounding clade Grue. The clade of Hoatzins, penguins, and creatures with toes that look like this, just to get us started. It's going to be a fun journey. But let's take a moment to discuss what it means to be a living fossil. And I'll start by saying that living fossil isn't really a scientific designation. There isn't actually anything that is exactly the same as its ancient ancestors, even if they look superficially similar. But the term generally refers to organisms without other close relatives that still resemble their ancient ancestors, at least more than they resemble anything else. The truth is that all living organisms are the descendants of ancient ancestors. Your ancestors survived the extinctions at the end of the Cretaceous and Triassic just as much as did the ancestors of modern crocodiles, horseshoe crabs, or Hoatzins. In fact, your ancestors survived every extinction event, ever. But humans are not generally considered living fossils because the basic human form is a more recent development, whereas the horseshoe crab body plan has been working for much longer. And humans have many surviving close relatives, whereas horseshoe crabs are not diverse today and have no living close relatives. Though it should be mentioned that modern horseshoe crabs are much larger than their earliest ancestors, with fused abdominal segments, unlike the unfused segments of their early ancestors. So not the same, but far more similar to their ancestors than they are to anything else living today, living fossils. Hoatzins may not have any living relatives in their order, but they are sister to 2 other orders. The orders Gruiformes, 6 rad families including cranes and their crazy relatives, and Charadriiformes, the 19 families of bodacious shorebirds. And I don't know which of these 2 orders I'm most excited about. I mean, I love cranes so much. Sandhill cranes fill my soul with joy. And most of their relatives are awesome birds that most people have no idea even exist. But the other group has penguins. Real penguins. And button quails, which aren't quails at all. Not even close. Not to mention the Utah state bird, as well as birds with crazy long legs or crazy giant toes. Yeah, I think we better start here. Charadriiformes, as I already mentioned, includes 19 families, almost 400 species, and almost all of them are associated with water, though in sometimes very different ways. And not always. This order is composed of 2 large clades, each containing 2 smaller clades. One full of Clover-shaped birds, and the other one full of all kinds of madness. And I'll probably go through the clover-like clade pretty fast because I want to get to the big toes, false quail, and real penguins sooner than later. But the 8 families of plover-shaped wading birds form the suborder Charadriiformes, which has 1 clade with 3 members and another with 5. And both include members called plovers, and a lot of things not generally called plovers. I guess I'll start with the most ploverly lineage, the one that includes plovers and the Egyptian plover. Which of the 5 families in this clade is the most distantly related to the actual plovers? And while it is found in Africa, it isn't found in Egypt, so killer name. But it is the only species in the family Pluvianidae, also known as a crocodile bird, which is easy to identify by the amazing black pattern that it has forming kind of like a necklace, a cape, a hat, and an eye stripe. It's pretty easy to spot a crocodile bird. And crocodile bird is a much better name than Egyptian plover, in my assessment, as they actually are birds. And they do often live in close proximity to crocodiles. Though the long-held belief that they had a symbiotic relationship with crocodiles where they served as a sort of crocodile toothpick has been unsubstantiated by any sort of formal observation of the interactions between the 2 species. So not a great name, but better than Egyptian plover. I would call it the close to, but not quite Egyptian, close to, but not quite plover. Because the family in this clade next most distantly related to the other 3 is the family Charadriidae, the 69 or so species of plovers, with some being called lapwings, dotterels, and killdeer, but for no apparent phylogenetic reason. We call all kinds of non-plovers plovers, but some plovers we don't call plovers. Sometimes a plover just feels like it might off a cervid, lick a wing, or be in a state of age-related cognitive decline. But if you had to pick a common name for the entire clade, it would most reasonably be plovers, many of which, interestingly, live in Egypt. So just remember, there are many Egyptian plovers. The Egyptian plover just does not happen to be one of them. Still better than Congo snake. In general, actual plovers have fairly robust bodies, short necks, straight bills, and short tails. Except for the one that has been accused of killing Bambi's mother. Most have 3 short, forward-facing toes, with the hind toe being highly reduced or entirely absent. Most of the smaller ones have pointed wings, though larger species tend to have more rounded wings. It's the large ones that tend to be called lapwings. Maybe the wings look like a tongue. I just don't know what lapwings are. Sounds like a possible side effect of drinking too many Red Bulls. You should probably consult a doctor if they last more than 4 hours. So that is what plovers look like. But what if you made the neck a little longer, the beak a little longer, and the legs way, way longer? What then? Well, then you would have the family in this clade next most distantly related to the remaining 2. A member of the family Recurvostridae, one of the roughly 10 species of stilts and avocets. The family name Recurvostridae almost certainly reflects the recurved bills of the avocets. Recurved meaning that it curves upward, rather the opposite of a decurved beak that we'll see here in a second. The remaining 2 families are one another's closest relatives. The family Ibidorhynchidae, the ibis bill, which has a decurved beak, like we see in ibises, and the family Haematopotidae, the 12 species of oyster catchers. And I'll start with the ibis bill. You're not going to mix it up with anything else we've discussed today. That decurved bill is enough to set it apart. But they do call it an ibis bill for a reason. They don't call it an ibis because it's not an ibis. Ibises are more closely related to hummingbirds than they are to ibis bills. But they too are wading birds with decurved beaks. And if you were in the middle of Asia and saw a bird by that description, it might be difficult to tell what you were looking at. Ibis bills can be identified by their black face and collar, both trimmed in white, as well as just by the bill itself. Yes, it is decurved, but it is thinner than most actual ibis bills. Of course, calling ibis bills ibises might be no more absurd than calling emperor penguins penguins, but here we are. And ibises are fairly close relatives of emperor penguins, whereas ibis bills are closer to real deal penguins, though they are much more closely related to oyster catchers. In fact, oyster catchers are their closest living relatives, period, which are black or black and white, robust wading birds with thick, straight orange beaks found especially in coastal areas in most parts of the globe. So that's the big ploverly lineage. The little lineage contains just 3 families. And of the 3, the one most distantly related to the other 2 are the 10 species of stone-curlews in the family Borinidae. Stone-curlews are often called thick knees because of their thick, ankles. You'd never know if they had thick knees or not because bird knees are tucked up close to their bodies and are really not visible when the feathers are in place. Though you can see the knees on featherless chickens. Because of this, and because birds, like other theropod dinosaurs, stand on their toes, digitigrade, it can often look to us like their knees bend backwards. They don't. They have normal knees. Those are just their ankles. They just have long feet. People often make this mistake with ungulate mammals like horses as well. Truth is, the ways that legs bend seems to be conserved across tetrapods. If you want to see backwards knees, you're gonna need a grasshopper or something. But take a brownish, relatively generic-looking wading bird and give it an enormous yellow eyeball, and knobby ankles, apparently, and Bob's your uncle, you have one of the 10 species of stone-curlews, which are not closely related to actual curlews. Their closest relatives are, instead, the final 2 families of plover-like wading birds. The 2 species of sheathbills in the family Chionidae, and the Magellanic plover, the only member of the family Pluvianellidae, which, as you probably guessed, isn't a real plover. Unless everything we've discussed so far have been plovers. Or being a plover has nothing to do with being the descendant of plovers. Just anybody who looks a bit like a plover gets to be one. Sheathbills look basically like all-white plovers, which is a color that makes sense as they live pretty much only in close proximity to Antarctica. Their closest relative, the Magellanic plover, also lives near Antarctica, specifically the southern tip of South America, the closest part of any other continent to Antarctica, and a place where you might also see a sheathbill. But you won't confuse the two because Magellanic plovers are not white. Same shape, but a more seagull-like coloration, and red legs and eyes. Scary red eyes. Okay, that's enough plover-like birds. There will be more things called plovers, but I can't tell you why. They don't look like plovers, because they are part of the all kinds of madness clade, and the remaining 11 families in the Charadriiformes. Now, this madness clade contains really all of the Charadriiform families that I was most excited to discuss, such as the big toes, false quail, and real penguins. The bonkers clade contains 2 suborders. The suborder Scolopaci, which contains big toes and snipes.
You ever heard of a snipe?
In fact, it would not be unreasonable to call the whole suborder snipes. The snipe suborder is phylogenetically next door to the suborder Larry. I'm going to start with the snipes, but don't worry, I'll never forget about Larry, no matter how I try. Snipes, sandpipers, curlews, godwits, dog-witchers, woodcocks, phalaropes, shanks, tattlers, ruffs, surfbirds, knots, yellowlegs, whimbrels, and turnstones, and more, make up the nearly 100 species in the family Scolopacidae, the family most distantly related to the rest of the Scolopaci. And no, there is no phylogenetic rhyme or reason to those names. They're all meaningless. Probably just every time someone's little brother actually came back with a snipe, their older siblings made up a new name for it so that the hunt wouldn't be over. But you said the last one was a woodcock. This one's different. You lied! I'm telling Mom! No, you're right. Don't tell. That one's, Tattler. because he's gonna tattletale? Shh. Yeah, that's a tattler. But once you find a real snipe, you can totally hang out with us. Oh, nice try, Gary. That does look a lot like a snipe, but that one's actually a woodcock. But you said the last one was a woodcock. This one's different. You lied! I'm telling Mom! Anyway, whatever your big brother called them, members of the Scolopacidae are very sensitive birds, in that they have highly touch-sensitive beaks. Long legs with generally long, sensitive beaks, which is good because their eyes are very far back on their heads, and well out of the water, mud, or soil where they hunt, by feel, using that beak in a manner that resembles the operation of a sewing machine. The rest of the Scolopacidae fall into two clades, each containing two families. And since one contains the giant toe guys that I've been teasing since the beginning, I'll start with that clade. While not all of the members of the family Scolopacidae are called snipes, it can easily be argued that all of the Scolopacidae are snipes, not just the Scolopacidae. I say this because one of the two families is the clade commonly called painted snipes, they being the three species in the family Rostratulidae. And they won't be the last snipes that we will discuss in the Scolopacidae. That said, their closest relatives are not the other snipes. They're the 8 species of jacanas in the family Jacanidae, which I first fell in love with when I worked in the Pangani forest at Disney's Animal Kingdom. The ones we had there were African jacanas. And what was it about this particular snipe that won me over? It was their toes. And not the fact that they often seem to have dozens of them, on who knows how many legs. Though I do love that about them. I'll tell you what's going on in a second. It's the absolute length of those crazy toes, which is the best way to distinguish them from pretty much anything else. They also have 10 tail feathers instead of the 12 common in wading birds. But really, who is counting their tail feathers without first noticing those massive digits? Who? Tell me who! As for the deal with those digits, jacanas make a living walking around on lily pads and other aquatic vegetation. And I don't know if you've ever attempted to walk on a lily pad, but it helps to spread out your weight a little. Here are some people standing on lily pads. And here is a person attempting to stand on one without putting something in to disperse her weight. See that disc that they put under your feet? I call that a jacana disc. Nobody else does, but we can all start calling it that. It'll catch on. But what about all those legs? That is called being a great dad. In jacanas, females are generally larger than males, and after they lay the eggs, they leave. And the male is the one that ends up raising the offspring alone. And sometimes, when you're a great dad, you have to pick up your kids and carry them across some lily pads. Am I right? As for painted snipes, they look like snipes, just with slightly more elaborate and less cryptic coloration than other snipes. And again, for these to be snipes, then the entire clade Scolopacidae, they all need to be snipes, including jacanas. I don't have a problem with that. I just wanted to be sure we were all on the same page. Which leaves us with the final two families of snipes. The family Pedionomidae, the plains wanderer, and Thinocoridae, the 4 species of seed snipes. Now we are still discussing wading birds, but nothing about the name plains wanderer suggests anything about wading. It sounds like something that spends time out in grasslands, wandering. And it sounds that way because that's exactly what they do. And that was working out great for them in Australia until humans decided to turn many of the best grasslands into farmland and release foxes, which are great at hunting terrestrial birds that choose to run away from danger and stink at flying. As a consequence, these awesome birds are really struggling today. But if you're in Australia and happen to see one, females are very easy to recognize because they have a black and white collar and a reddish-brown spot on their chest just below the collar. Males are smaller. They still have a round body and the short tail of females, but lack the distinctive markings that you find on females. He is much more cryptically colored. And this probably has to do with the fact that, as was the case in most jacanas, it is the male that incubates the eggs and raises the offspring. Their closest relatives, the seed snipes, are from South America. And if you've seen our video about all of the marsupials, you will know that South American species, being closely related to Australian species, is not uncommon and happens for a very good reason. Most snipes eat primarily animals, but you could probably tell from the name alone that seed snipes might be different. And you'd be right, just not about exactly what they eat. Seed snipes are herbivorous, which I think is also largely true for plains wanderers, but I can't seem to substantiate that. So they do eat plants, just not seeds. And I do think there's a reasonable case for calling them snipes, but they don't look much like snipes. Honestly, I think they look more like grouses. They super aren't, but that's what they look like. Basically, if you told me to draw you a picture of the most generic looking burst flying bird, I would probably draw a seed snipe. Though they do have longer wings for their size than do most ground dwelling burst flyers, so that is one thing that sets them apart. So those are the snipes. But boy, what a joker, what a funny guy we still have to discuss. Because we still need to talk about the clade next door to the snipes. You remember Larry? Well, I do. So a while back, I was hanging out with a friend of mine who happens to have a PhD in biology and studies phylogenetics, and who keeps these little birds, button quail. When I happened to mention that button quails are not quails at all. And I will tell you that he was most skeptical. Even after I showed him sources backing up my outlandish claim, I don't think he would have been any more shocked if I had put Bengay inside his jockstrap and filled his toothpaste tube up with glue. So if they're not quails, what are they? Well, they're part of the clade Larry, meaning that they are super close relatives of actual penguins. In fact, button quails have no extant relatives more closely related to them than they were to penguins. Again, not these, real penguins. OG penguins. And given that quails are galliform birds, that means that other than the paleognath birds like cassowaries, emus, and ostriches, there are no living birds more distantly related to button quails than are quails. Among the Neognathi, which includes nearly all of the birds, quails are as far from button quails as it gets. But the 18 species of button quails that make up the family Turnicidae really do look and act a lot like little quails. Just like false penguins look and act a lot like real penguins did. But we'll get to that soon enough. Anyway, button quails are small, round-bodied running birds that hang out in grasslands and generally avoid flying. And most of the time, again, it's the male that raises the offspring. And the female tends to be the more conspicuously colored of the two sexes. The best way to distinguish them from true quail is to notice that they lack a hind toe, which is why molecular phylogenetics is so valuable. Convergence can be a beast. All right, let's get to some penguins. The closest relatives to the button quails are obviously not quails. And they include OG penguins, but not just OG penguins, but indeed all 5 of the other families in the Larry, which fall into 2 clades, one with 2 families and the other with 3. And I'm going to start with the family with 3 because I want to get to the penguins ASAP. And of these 3 families, the family most distantly related to the other 2 is the most Larry of all the Larry families, the family Laridae, which includes the state bird of the state of Utah. You know, the California gull. But don't worry, the Colorado blue spruce is no longer our state tree. And while our state fossil is Allosaurus, Utah raptor is now our state dinosaur. So we have 3 official state dinosaurs, more than any other state, even if one of our dinosaurs is named after another state.
That makes Utah the best. And don't I deserve the best?
Well, of course. I mean, you do. The family Laridae contains a lot more than just our beloved gull that saved the early settlers from overeating and becoming obese on the abundance of easily digestible protein that descended upon them in the form of nearly unlimited hordes of flightless katydids, aka Salt Lake shrimp, like an all-you-can-eat pioneer inland seafood extravaganza. It indeed contains all of the gulls, as well as terns, noddies, and skimmers. About 105 total species. And just for the record, except for the white tern, which is closer to being a noddy, each of these common names does appear to correspond to a monophyletic group within the family. So that's pretty cool. And despite not being closely related, larids are generally highly aerial birds that seem more like albatrosses and other tube-nosed birds than they are like button quails, despite being much more closely related to button quails. And though they are more closely related to tube-nosed birds than button quails are to quail, that similarity is mostly due to convergence, not shared ancestry. They aren't closely related to tube-nosed birds. Those are the closest relatives of the false penguins. But these do look very similar, just without the pitot tube nostrils. All with a fairly seagull-like shape, with the skimmers being the most unusual due to their odd underbite that facilitates their skimming hunting strategy. The closest relatives to the larids are the families Stone-curlews, 7 species of skuas, and Alcidae, the 25 extant species of auks, which are, to my knowledge, all flighted and not as great as auks technically could be, or at least used to be. While I would call this family the auks, you are probably most familiar with puffins, which are part of it and fill me with absolute joy, and are featured on one of my favorite Clint Reptiles shirts. It also includes auklets, mewers, mewlets, guillemots, and the closest living relative to the now extinct penguins, the razorbill. In general, auks look like penguins. They are counter-shaded black with white bellies, with an upright posture and webbed feet. And when I say that they look like penguins, that is because penguins are, or were rather, auks. So saying that they look like penguins is a bit like saying that cats look like tigers. This giant flightless auk is the great auk, Penguinus impennis. And they weren't called Penguinus because they looked like penguins. They were called Penguinus because they were the penguins. And they were common in the North Atlantic until humans drove them to extinction in just the mid-1800s. They were so familiar to sailors that when sailors started running into large, upright, counter-shaded, flightless seabirds in the southern hemisphere, they called them penguins. Just like the Spaniards called turkeys pavo, the Spanish word for peafowl. Not because turkeys are peafowl, or the southern hemisphere cousins of tube noses are penguins, but because those were the most similar animals that they knew to exist. Of course, because turkeys became so much more common for people to encounter than peafowl, turkeys eventually became the best known pavos, leading to peafowl, including those of the genus pavo, being known as pavo real, real peafowl. Not royal peafowl, that is a common misconception. So the question really is just, what should we do about penguins? Should we call penguins of the genus Penguinus real penguins? Or penguins of the southern hemisphere false penguins? Or should we do both things? This picture has been in our studio for years, even now that the studio has been moved to Clint's Life Science Academy, which I will probably tell you more about soon. But I promised that I would never forget about Larry. And I'm not going to start with the true penguins. I love these southern hemisphere belly sliders. And they are a lot of things. They are reptiles. They are dinosaurs. They are silly and wonderful. But they aren't penguins. Not any more than Dimetrodon is a dinosaur or Tenrex are hedgehogs. But if there is one thing worse than having a seabird steal your name, it's having a seabird steal your lunch. Which is exactly how skuas, the closest living relatives to the auks, live their lives. They are called kleptoparasites, which has to be up there with conglobate and toxicognaths for being one of the world's greatest words. Skuas are the pirates of Larry. But don't let that fool you into thinking that they don't do anything. They don't just stay home and lie around. These guys cruise around looking for their cousins, mostly gulls and terns, that have found something tasty to eat. Then they hoist up the Jolly Roger and steal it for themselves. And they aren't deterred by larger birds neither. They'll happily plunder from birds many times their own size and kill and eat birds smaller than themselves. Take what you can, give nothing back. And as much as they seem to target members of their own clade, including puffins and other auks, they also rob and kill false penguins on the regular. Real puffins, real penguins, false penguins, they have no allegiances to anyone but themselves. In general, they look like dark seagulls. Often overall dark, but sometimes with only a dark face. And a black heart, I would assume. Which brings us to the other clade in the Larry, and the final two families in the Charadriiformes. The 17 species of Pratincoles and coursers in the family Glariolidae, and the crab plover of the family Dromididae, which, like the Egyptian plover, but to a much greater degree, isn't a plover at all. Glariolids are an old world group found in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Australia. Pratincoles tend to have forked tails and hunt insects in flight like swallows. Coursers, on the other hand, run around on the ground, as their name would suggest, and hunt insects mostly at night or during periods of low light. And both are recognizable by their beaks, which are short and slightly curved. Now, in case you need a reminder, here are a few plovers. They have a look. And finding out that another bird exists that is not a plover but called a crab plover should probably make you think it must look like a plover. Like how false penguins look like real penguins. But no. This is a crab plover. For waders, plovers tend to have short legs, short necks, and short bills. Crab plover. I mean, it looks more like a plover than it does like a donkey. Honestly, though, it looks more like a heron than it does like a plover. And that big, thick, long beak for eating crabs is totally different. In addition to looking nothing like plovers and eating crabs, they're also interesting because they nest in burrows, unlike any of their close relatives. Definitely something cool to look for on the coastline of the Indian Ocean. So that is it for Larry, and indeed all of the Charadriiformes. I hope you never forget them. But that is only one of the two orders of birds that are the closest living relatives to the Hoatzins. Because, as Master Yoda would say,
There is another.
But this has already been an epic video. So we will finish this tour and discuss why this apparently primitive lineage of living fossils is, in fact, not so primitive at all, and what's going on with these toes here in just a few weeks. Though I think we need to talk about the world's largest lizard first. So subscribe if you don't want to miss that. As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to our patrons on Patreon, and just let those of you who already support us on Patreon or those that are considering it know that this week's Patreon extra in this video is a doozy. We are all over the place, plus we have exciting news because we're in a new place. There is so much going on in this week's video. Hop over there and check it out. You should probably consult a doctor if they last more than 4 hours. Ibidorinkidae. Ibidorinkidae. Ibidorinkidae.
Ibidorinkidae.
Ibidorinkidinkidae. Ibidorinkidee. They have no allegiances to anyone but themselves. In general, they look like dark seagulls.
I'm actually surprised you're able to get out on Halloween. That's all you do.
Can't ruin your magic, Jason.